I would like to greet everybody at the Psychoanalytic Cinema Club. Today we shall discuss a film Kirschblüten by Doris Dörrie, which has many reading contexts. So today we shall look at this film from different angles. From the side of psychoanalysis, the side of modern dance, Butoh, the side of cultural studies, and my friends and colleagues will describe it more circumstantially. From my part, I would like to remind some points from psychoanalytical theory of mourning. All of us experience loss, but we don't have a universal mechanism of dealing with it. And Sigmund Freud, in his Trauer und Melancholie, describes two basic scenarios: mourning, usual for neurosis, and melancholy, usual for psychosis. What's the difference? Let's pay attention to 2 points. Firstly, a neurotic person can split his ego, and secondly, he can farewell to that part of his ego which was attached to the lost object. Like a starfish can lose one tentacle and then grow up a new one. Freud calls that neurotic mechanism, neurotic process, a work of mourning, a Trauerarbeit. That means that it would not happen on its own, but we have to work on it. If this does not happen, the patient falls down into melancholia, in which he cannot divide his ego. The personality of melancholic subject is always motionless, monolithic, and like a monumental, you know. Therefore, we cannot get rid of that part of the self which was tied up with the lost object. The melancholic person does not say goodbye, but buries his ego together with the object. Freud said, bei der Trauer ist die Welt arm und leer geworden. Bei der Melancholie ist es das Ich gesetzt. That is, the ego of melancholic person became empty inside. But what does it mean, a work of mourning? There is no common way of mourning, but each time we have to discover, to create, or to invent one's own way of farewell. That is, grief must be made a creative and artificial process, in my mind. To illustrate that idea and that topic, let's remember how melancholy was usually depicted in painting. Noted that melancholy is almost always shown as immobility, stiffness, numbness, or frozenness. For example, look at the most famous an engraving of melancholy by Albrecht Dürer. There are two thoughtful angels and sleeping dog. All the tools has been abandoned, all activities stopped, and angels were lost in meditation. It's a symbol of frozenness. Or let us look for another picture. La cattive madri di Giovanni Sigantini. Do you recognize him? This artist was the patient of Karl Abraham and went down into the history of psychoanalysis as the first clinical case of a maniac depressive psychosis. Notice how the mother's body is fused with the tree, forming a monolith unity. Just look at this. This is the body of melancholic person, which is wooden monument of pain. Those colleagues who work with clinical depression may often observe similar wooden stiffness in their patient. And by the way, in St. Petersburg, there is a Butoh dancing troupe called Дерево, means wood. And 1 month ago, we recently saw its frontman, Anton Adasinsky, starring in the film Faust by Alexander Sokurov. And the hero of our film is also trying to cope with the loss of his wife, but does not know how. Firstly, he fulfills her desire and goes to Japan, where she was always dreamed to come. But there he wanders around the city pointlessly. It does not work. Then he begins to wear her clothes as a Winnicottian transitional object. But it does not work also. He literally put on his mourning like a dress. When he meets a girl, a Butoh dancer, he discovers a way to symbolize his loss through movement and to take off his dress of grief. The work of mourning, in my mind, Trauerarbeit, is to help the psychic apparatus move, to strip up and reset it, both physically and mentally, through bodily practices and dancing, yoga, Butoh, and so on. To revive the wood with the help of movement. The Butoh dancer tells Rudy, everyone who has a shadow can dance Butoh. That means that dance is a meeting with one's other side, a return of the repressed feelings, and artificial process of reset one's own personality. In a conclusion, I have to say that Butoh dance is the ideal practice for resignifying and reassembling identity, because historically it originated in Japan, which also experienced an identity crisis after defeat in the World War II. And the emperor's rejection of divine origin. I know personally some older Japanese people who were shocked, not only the emperor's abdiction, but the very fact that he spoke on the radio like a human. That is, the leaf voice of emperor caused a depression and identity crisis in Japanese society. Butoh dance emerged as a response to that crisis, as an attempt to recollect and resignify and to find new identity, to get rid of what trauma and put on a new Japanese identity. I write about this in more details in my book on the theater, where one chapter is devoted to Butoh dance. I would like to thank you for your attention and would like to pass the word to Dr. Jorge Eduardo Catelli, who proposed that film for discussion and prepare a report. Por favor, amigo, cuéntanos su interpretación de la película.
Con mucho gusto, con mucho gusto. So, first of all, I would like to thank you, my dear friend, for this generous idea of inviting me to participate in this meeting. And thank you all for this stimulating group, and that you're there to hear some of my ideas that I have been working for a long time, and therefore I think this is something interesting for me to be able to talk about this movie, because it's so beautiful and it's so hard at once. I have a couple of metapsychological ideas that I'd like to share with you, trying to understand, or at least just to tell you how I see and what can I think in some certain problems of this, of our metapsychology, and how we see it plastically in this film. First part, an introduction to some questions that arise from this film. In today's presentation, I'm going to take up some aspects that have particularly interested me from the many things that the film Kirschblüten Hanami has to offer. Some of the issues that have most impacted me in this wonderful film are, as is often the case, issues that I have been researching for years, which are at the heart of the development of the film, I think. I'm referring not only to the fleeting nature of life and ineffable nature of death, but also to the psychic processes that psychoanalysis has discovered and theorized about in relation to losses, and what we subjects do with these losses that are always untimely, that even the most expected and predictable ones impact us and go through us abysmally. The research and theoretical clinical developments of psychoanalysis today invite us to be able to delve deeper into the understanding of the processes at play in mourning, as well as in pathological mourning and melancholy. I'm going to address some ideas based not only on mourning and melancholia, but also on transience. The idea of substitutability of the objects occupies Freud throughout his work. In Instincts and the Destinies of Instincts, or Drives, I say better drives, Freud states that the object of the drive, instinct, also der Trieb, is the most variable and serves as a goal in order to find satisfaction. And in Outlines of Psychoanalysis, he underlines two characteristics of the libido: fixation and mobility. However, we cannot assimilate mobility with fixation in a simple asymmetrical opposition. The work of mourning entails an unavoidable relationship between the inscription of loss and fixation. Infidelity to the deceased objects, being alive, is unavoidably subject to the course of the variability of objects. Regarding these psychic processes, I find one of the central subjects of my research, in my doctoral thesis, and in my promotion to full member and training analyst, I refer to identification. The way in which identification is woven into subjectivity, as well as in its paths, and even the failures in its achievement, should, or at least I think it shows some of the axes that we can follow in Rudy's mourning for Trudy. We can also follow the path of introjections as a fantasized way of incorporating the object. I will refer to these metapsychological themes to address some questions to share with you from our art and science, the psychoanalysis. Okay, second, the film that brings us together today and that makes me so glad. Doris Dörrie directs the wonderful Hannelore Elsner in the role of Trudy, Elmar Wepper als Rudi, and Aya Irizuki as you, in a film full of impact, surprise, and tenderness, whose title refers to a festival in Tokyo and evokes precisely the central idea of this film, the possibility of recognizing, metaphorically speaking, the cherry blossom life precisely because of its ephemeral nature, its transitory nature. The couple, the married couple, Trudy and Rudi Angermeyer, live in a small town in Bayern. In the first scenes, the director makes us accomplices in a fact that Trudy knows, but not Rudi. He's seriously ill and has only a few months to live. Rudi decides to keep the secret, and Doris, with the audience, with us, and tries to enjoy traveling with her husband outside his immediate surroundings. He's a very traditional and homely man. He's a Beamter, that's a word in German that has an enormous semantic resonance. He's a civil guy, civil servant, so to say, a gray and routine being. However, she convinces him to go to visit his children and grandchildren in Berlin. After a few days, they discover that the children cannot look after them and are uncomfortable and decide to spend a few days alone and quiet in the Baltic Sea. There, when both the main characters and the audience, as in everyday life, we assume that life will be as we have planned, unexpectedly and suddenly, it is Trudy who shows the unpredictability of Ananke, that other dimension of reality, of the real, the Lacanian concept, which arrives without warning, breaking all plans and imposing a void in the face of the loss of the object, loaded with investments and representations in the psyche of those who love it. And this is where at least for me, where the film begins. From that moment on, Rudi will enter an unexpected universe faced with loss, with a libido that is leaking from him like an internal hemorrhage. That's Freud, 1895, right? And he will go through various states of external and internal searching in its psychic world, in which identification will show the unconscious work of thoughts that will take on various forms, trying at times to fulfill the wishes that Trudy left pending, starting with one of the most important, her passion for Japan and for Butoh dance, taking advantage of the fact that her son, Karl, lives in Tokyo. But once there, he discovers that he's also bothering his son. Although Rudi does everything possible to distract himself and adapt to such a big city and such a different culture, it is a plastic way of discovering the unknown world of his wife, now lost. It is a way of understanding the lost object, trying to identify with it. And this is something that I'm gonna keep working on. There begins a certain confusion between Rudy's self and the representation of his most homophonous deceased wife, Trudy. Trudy, Rudy, Rudy, Trudy. I find it very interesting. It's a confusion that raises questions for the viewer and offers us psychoanalysts the possibility of delving into the psychic mechanisms that interest us so much, I hope. In this case, with the beauty of the poetry of plastic thought, just as it happens with dreams, in which these thoughts are transformed into images via condensation and displacement. Verschiebung und Verdichtung. After a visit to a park, Rudy meets you, a young Butoh dancer who always dances there on the banks of a lake surrounded by cherry blossoms. Despite language problems, they form a deep friendship, and she teaches him, actually, the basics of this dance and makes him live naturally the relationship between life and death. Finally, you and Rudy embark on a journey together to see Mount Fuji, where after a few days of waiting, while the clouds cover it, he can dance in front of it at dawn and in a certain way reunite with his deceased wife. Initial questions. One of the many questions that arise after watching cherry blossoms is whether we should live the time we have left to live to the fullest or continue with the daily routine. It's a philosophical question, but we're psychoanalysts. And the answer is divided into two parts in the film. The first, which refers to the, at least this is what I find in the film, right? The first is which refers to the encounters and disagreements of parents with their children. Does not seem to be the best solution, since everyone lives their own life in turn, abandoning the gaze of those who love the most. And at the same time, there is that very, at least as I know the German culture, that very German idea that the second part of life begins when one realizes that actually there's only one. A second possible answer is even simpler, and I'd like to quote a haiku. And the haiku goes, "Our destinies always alive in the heart of the cherry tree." This belongs to Matsuo Basho, one of the great figures of Japanese poetry and of the Edo era, who was able to observe how to practice of hanami. Hanami means literally my contemplation of flowers, hana, right? Extended to all levels of the society. Dörrie addresses the enigmas of existence, and it perhaps one of the best films for those who would like to have a little clarity with their eyes closed about their own interior, about what life is, about also its fragility and its questions in contrast to death, emptiness, uncertainty, and reality. And that is what Cherry Blossom says, an interior road movie. Kirschblüten is this kind of film. Cherry trees like Butoh dance wave their story, a story that interweaves life, death, mourning, and melancholy, together with identification as processes rich in their becoming and their psychic functions for human thought. The images of nature are juxtaposed with the emotional states that they can suggest a continuous oscillation of interior and exterior. It's a kind of Möbius band, you know? Butoh is associated with the idea of a freedom that on the outside seems ridiculous or meaningless, a search and a space for emancipation. The very film is a journey in search of meaning, awareness, and the possibilities of reinventing the freedom of a mature man who is also a human being, accustomed to his routine. The emotional relationships, always interrupted and terminated by the fact of death, tend to be melodramatic. The driving force of the action and the way it is presented through the blossoming of the cherry trees, as well as the complex world of Butoh, remain as almost dreamlike pretexts for addressing these subjects. And I really find it like kind of dream, right? Fourth point that I'd like to point. In the words of Doris Dörrie, I take a little part that I want to share with you from an interview in 2008. And she asks herself, what is Butoh? This is Doris Dörrie, yeah? Like Zen and mono-nowhere, it's difficult to put it into words, the meaning of Butoh. I did not discover Butoh in Japan. I discovered it one night on television. I was watching a documentary by Peter Zempe on Arte about Kazuo Ono, the famous Butoh dancer. Butoh emerged in the 60s as a mix of Japanese hippie culture and German expressionist dance. Butoh is about capturing light and shadow, birth and death, awareness of being and the interruption of existence. Joy turns into pain before turning back into joy. And watching Kazuo Ono was fascinating to me, says Doris Dörrie. Dressed in women's clothes, holding a flower in his hand, he danced in slow motion. He did not do much else. It was not a pantomime performance, not an attempt to play a woman, but something different. Something I had never seen before. It was the visual portrait of the presence of the dead inside each of us. I started looking for someone who teaches Butoh in Germany and thought the internet I could find the world-renowned Butoh dancer, and I did, Tadashi Endo. He lived and taught in Göttingen. I signed up for one of his workshops, and the first test Tadashi gave me was to clean the floor in the way I had been taught at the Nata monastery, because she had been in Japan before, right? The story of cherry blossoms also begins with Tadashi teaching the link that exists with our ancestors and all our movements. End of the quote. All right. The presence of the dead can have various readings from our psychoanalysis, in particular with regard to the theories that we can begin to address metapsychologically for mourning and melancholy, but especially the Vergänglichkeit, the transience, and historical comment, as Strachey mentions in the introductory note to the texts that I cited above. Jones reports 1955 that Freud sent Abraham the draft of this article, making comments regarding the relationship between melancholia and the oral stage of the libido before it was published, because Abraham had a certain influence, 1910, 1913. Abraham says in 1924, developing the ideas that he had already begun to put forward in publications from 1911 and 1916, that melancholy is an archaic form of grief Mourning, no? The process of grieving involves this consolation. My loved object is not gone, for now I carry it within me, and I can never lose it. End of the quote. Making reference in this way to the consumption, as he himself refers to it, of the corpse of the deceased in primitive rites as a psychic process identical to that which occurs in melancholy, based on a hypothesis of Roheim, according to whom the rituals of mourning in their archaic form consisted of the devouring of the corpse. Let us think for a moment about Rudi's way of assuming mourning for Trude's death with concrete actions, with acts and deeds, making his desired trips, being in Tokyo, introducing himself to Butoh, and dressing in her own clothes. However, beyond Abraham ideas, Freud had already defined the concept of identification early as a way of thinking. In the psychic apparatus, a spontaneous way of functioning, which gives us an important clue to understand psychoanalytically some of Dörrie's idea. That is to say, we can glimpse waves of thinking in identification, just as we learn that behind the manifest contents of the dream, there are unconscious thoughts plastically transformed under the laws of condensation and displacement. I link the work of successful identification of integration with the ego, the mechanisms linked to mourning, a step-by-step detachment from libidinal investments in that with time and psychic pain in order to reconnect with memories and with the object world, other representations, which means other objects. These can also be failed mechanisms. In the latter case, the effects of introjections occur mostly in the style of splinters impacting the psyche, in which the dead weight on the body of the living, and whose best example is the superego. Doris Dörrie shows us much of this disquisition with the poetic beauty of this film. Fifth, some metapsychological reflections. And I say mourning, instead mourning and melancholy, mourning or melancholy. What is the poetry of Kirschblüten about? Along with question about the fragility of life, along with transience, it is the story of a pathological mourning. Is it a melancholy? Is it a process of mourning that requires a provisional identification with the deceased? Freud's first references to melancholy are from 1892 and 1893, when he compares neurosis with it. In neurosis, and I'm not referring here to hysteria, says Freud, right? I'm reading Freud. But to the status nervousness in general, we may suppose the primary presence of a tendency to an easiness, to a lowering of self-consciousness, as we know it in melancholia, as an isolated symptom in its extreme development. End of quote. As in manuscript E, where he deals with the genesis of anxiety, and in manuscript G, entitled Melancholia, he attempts in both to explain in a rather neurological terms. On the first, he defines it as a product of the accumulation of psychic sexual tension, describing it in the following terms. I'm quoting Freud. Melancholics have been particularly frequently anesthetized. They have no need and no feeling for intercourse, but a great longing for love in a psychic form, a psychic tension of love, one might say. When this accumulates and remains unsatisfied, melancholia is generated. This would then be a corresponding symptom of anxiety neurosis. When psychical sexual tension builds up, anxiety neurosis. When psychic sexual tension builds up, melancholy. In the second, I found it interesting to find the idea of internal hemorrhage, which produces, and I'm quoting Freud, impoverishment of excitation of available resources in the style of what he would propose in 1914 in Introduction to Narcissism, namely, I quote Freud, the loosening of association is always painful. Through an internal hemorrhage, let us say, an impoverishment of excitation of available resources is born, which manifests itself in the other drives and operations. As an inhibition, this withdrawal has the same effect as a wound. And I invite you to see the theory of psychic pain for Freud. And the same effect as a wound, analogously to pain, end of quote. It is, however, in manuscript N, attached to his letter 64, dated in Vienna on May the 31st, 1897, where we can find a genuine predecessor of mourning and melancholia. In this, he will put forward ideas that will guide this through, even with the temporary influences of other colleagues, which he will periodically take up. This, says Freud, impulses the hostile ones towards the parents are repressed at times when compassion for the parents is aroused, for example, in their illnesses or their death. Then it is an externalization of grief to reproach oneself for their death, the so-called melancholia, or to punish oneself hysterically through the idea of retribution with the same states of illness that they have had. The identification that thus comes about is nothing other than a way of thinking. And that's something important to me to understand this film. A way of thinking, as we see, and it does not make the search for the motive superfluous. End of quote. I would like to draw particular attention to the final idea of the cited paragraph, since this is an idea that Freud will later take up together with that of incorporation as a root of identification. Incorporation as root of identification, and which later follow in his own thinking, we will see him vary, returning back to the beginning, to the conception of it as a mode of thought, as an unconscious deductive process based on a common element, which serves as support for the psychic apparatus to draw conclusions. Rudy would try, based on elements in common with his lost object, to understand more of his wife's world that he had not been able to share in life. In this grief and melancholy, where he specifically differentiates both processes metapsychologically throughout this process, namely, he begins by considering grief as a reaction to the loss of a loved person or an abstraction that takes its place, such as homeland, freedom, an ideal, etc. Then he explains the work of grief, and just a little thing. Don't you forget the etymological origin of Trauer, grief. Trauer in German comes from Mittelalthochdeutsch und Althochdeutsch trüren. Trüren. This word means the withdrawal of the gaze, like the image that you mentioned, Dmitry, at the beginning, taking one's gaze away from the object and turning it to oneself, as a withdrawal piece by piece of the subject's libidinal links with the lost object. Each of the memories and each of the expectations in which the libido was tied to the object are closed, overinvested, and in them the detachment of the libido is consummated. A little further on, he mentions the anticipation of what I consider to be the distinctive differential features between mourning and melancholia. In melancholy, unlike in mourning, what is truly lost, and just pay attention to this point, what is truly lost is a part of the ego, a part of the self. It is a part of the ego in accordance with the fact that there is a reduction of the ego feeling, das Ich-Gefühl. And in other circumstances, we feel justified in assuming such a loss, but we are unable to discern precisely what has been lost. And we may even more reasonably think that the patient cannot grasp in his consciousness what he has lost. The melancholic shows us something else that is lacking in mourning, an extraordinary lowering of his ego feeling, dieses Ich-Gefühl, an enormous impoverishment of the ego. In mourning, the world has become poor and empty. In melancholia, this happens to the ego itself. To account for this, Freud cites some preconditions for melancholy. There must have existed, on the one hand, a strong fixation, and on the other hand, a strong fixation to the love object, right? And on the other hand, in contradiction to this, a weak resistance to the object investment, and the latter being chosen on a narcissistic basis. Sixth point, the shadow of the object in the cherry blossom. In this very report that I mentioned, 2008, Dörrie says that at one point Tadashi Endo had told her that the dead dream of us, the dead dream of us. I find it beautiful. And those words have become a common thread for Doris, because according to her, if the dead dream of us, then it is possible that all the signs of transience that just little postcards sent to us by the dead. The already famous quote, "The shadow of the object fell on the self," I understand it, or falls on the ego, I understand it as the fall of a reflection of the object on the self, on the ego, and it is not the object itself, but rather that interception between the ego and the object that I consider corresponds to narcissistic identification, as explained in the previous sentence, that prevents the object from being such. It's only a shadow. In this way, the equation between ego and object is expressed as products of the previous narcissistic condition, which therefore implies confusion. The free libido did not withdraw into another object, but withdrew into the ego, served to establish an identification of the ego with the abandoned object. The shadow of the object fell thus upon the ego, which could henceforth be judged by a particular instance as an object, as the abandoned object. Thus, the loss of the object had to change into a loss of the ego, and the conflict between the ego and the loved person into a split between the critical ego and the ego altered by identification. Has Rudi lost an object from his world? Has he lost part of his ego, or has he lost both of them? I'm going to quote Freud. The analysis of melancholia teaches us that the ego can only kill itself by virtue of the retreat of object investments. It can treat itself as an object if it's allowed to direct against himself that hostility which falls upon an object and replaces the original reaction of the ego towards objects in the outside world. End of quote. And now I'm going to refer to identification as a work of thought, and as Rudi and the object, that relationship. The concept of identification can be traced back to Freud's work very early on. It appears already in the Project for a Psychology, and even in manuscript L, where he speaks of the role of the maids with whom, as I commented earlier, as I mentioned before, manuscript N attached to the letter 64, 1897, from the same period as the previous quote, the idea of identification appears as a way of thinking. And this is based on elements that the psychic apparatus takes in common. We see Rudi thinking with his actions, thinking with this Butoh dance, and trying to achieve a symbolic reunion, which gives some possible meanings to that whole in the real, which his loss cost to him. In the project, Freud shows this process, which involves thought with identification in terms of this encounter with the fellow man, with the next one, with the Nebenmensch is the word that he uses. And I'm going to quote it. It can be assumed that for this purpose, the interest in discerning the image perception is also invested by the ego. If the image perception is not absolutely new, that is, if there are points of coincidence with the image perception, it will now remember, it will evoke an image perception memory with which it coincides, at least in part. And then the previous process of thinking is repeated with this image memory. Let us now suppose that the object that provides the perception is similar to the subject, namely a Nebenmensch, a neighbor. In this case, the theoretical interest is undoubtedly explained by the fact that such an object is simultaneously the first object satisfaction and the first hostile object, as well as the only helping power. It is about the Nebenmensch, the neighbor, the next one, then, that the human being learns to discern. However, it is mourning and melancholy in relation to identification, the enclave where previous lines of thought converge, and these are the project, the interpretation of dreams, and introduction to of narcissism, to continue later fundamentally in psychology of the masses and the ego and the id. These lines of thought lead to the ideas of the similar complex, Nebenmensch complex, which will also be a precursor of identification, insofar as it consists of a kind of reflection on the origin of the understanding of the expressive acts of the others. Rudi needed to do something more in the identification process with his lost object, Trudi, with whom he needed to be his dead wife to reproduce those expressive acts of Butoh and to admire Mr. Fuji. Mr. Fuji is the way in Japan Mount Fuji is called. As Doris Dörrie says, more poetically, evoking Tadashi Endo, the dead dream of us, being dreamed by the dead, could be a way for the shadow of the object to fall on Rudi's ego, but also a possible way of moving from melancholy to mourning. Perhaps a possible path to that great grief that is human life itself, which sometimes has the opportunity to make conscious the ephemeral nature of life as beauty and as that bed on the life drive, as Freud reminds us in times of war in his magnificent article on transience. We will build up again all that war has destroyed, and perhaps on firmer ground are most lastingly than before. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jorge Eduardo, for your very interesting and detailed lecture about that film. And especially I thank you for highlight the relation between identification and mourning. In my mind, the best way to elaborate depression is to change the identification. By the way, do you know that in Japanese army on uniform strap, they have flowers of sakura as the symbol because they are ready to sacrifice their life, and this is the in my mind the best prevention against depression, to be ready to sacrifice your identity and find new one in lost, in emigration, and so on. So I thank you for a couple of ideas which I'm thinking about at the moment.
If you want, I can send you
and I would like
a paper for everyone who wants to read it, and I can prepare it for you, and with literature there, I send you.
Excellent. It would be great, and we are very thankful for you. And I would like to pass the word to next speaker, Dr. Ellis Kuzniar from Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. Please tell us your interpretation, your vision of that film. You're welcome.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak to your group today. I've had a long interest in psychoanalysis, and in particular the Trauer und Melancholie essay by Freud. In fact, I have a book that is on dogs, and it's entitled Melancholy is Dog, Reflections on Our Animal Kinship. And you might be able to see that, again, I'm so glad that you mentioned this, but here you can see I have in the background Melancholia's. Wait, of course, she's sitting there with her greyhound. And I start my first chapter of that book talking about this image together and talking about Kafka and Lucian Freud, of course, who is also related. And a lot of his images of his dogs are very similar to, in the posture then, of that torpid melancholia, as you described here. And of course, she has the sleeping dog at her feet, which is that symbol of immobility. I also discuss in that book the wonderful recounting by Marie Bonaparte entitled Topsy, where who was the one who gave, of course, she was the one who had given Freud his chows, but she talks about her own chow and how she is anticipating that dog's death because that dog has come with a diagnosis of cancer of the jaw, of all things. I'm also really interested in the issues of migration and mourning processes. I have living with me a Ukrainian refugee who is 24 years old and who is finishing an MA thesis here or an MA in computer science. And I think because she is not in the field that we are in the humanities and social sciences, that she is not very able, also because her English is poor, to verbalize how she is feeling. And she, to my mind, is really suffering from anorexia nervosa. And it's been very, very difficult for me to try to assist her. In any case, to talk about the film. So I am coming more from a perspective of cultural studies, and I am, I think, more critical of the film, especially because I'm going to focus more on some of the other characters who are in the film. I'll be talking a little bit more about the other family members, and certainly I'll be talking about you as well, too, who's also going through her own mourning process, and we cannot neglect her in our discussion. So I'll begin. In Freud's classic definition of the uncanny, das Unheimliche, that which has always been known becomes strange. I think it's a wonderful definition, but I don't think it necessarily applies to cherry blossoms. And in fact, I'm thinking cherry blossoms is quite the reverse. From the start of the film, for Trudy, home, the beautiful Bavarian Alps, is erased by the pictures of the exotic Mount Fuji. And so too for her husband once he departs on his journey of mourning. The strange, the East, becomes one's home where one travels to in order to establish familial relations lacking in the West. The Orient is domesticated as the European voyages to his or her narrative, to end his or her narrative trajectory there. Dörrie utilizes the Orient as a constitutive outside, allowing the self to find peace through the other. The Orient demarcates an exotic world where mysterious, odd rituals abound and to which the Westerner is exposed. As Edward Said has written in his opening remarks to his very famous study, Orientalism, the Orient was almost a European invention and has been since antiquity a place of romance, exotic beings, haunting memories, and landscapes, remarkable experiences, end quote. The thought of death is repressed in the mundane daily life of the ordinary Germans, as for Trudy, who cannot bring herself to mention her husband's terminal diagnosis to him nor to anyone else. Only the foreign art of Butoh allows entry to the world of mystery and death. So I'm very critical of this appropriation of the Orient. The desire for escape and the exotic is strong. In the first half of the film, the only person in the Angermeyer family who resists its lure is the father. But it is so strong that everybody else wishes the other family member dead so that they can experience the Abenteuer or adventure they otherwise don't have. The doctor at the start of the film recommends an Abenteuer, to which Trudy responds her husband doesn't like them. Yet she nonetheless drags him to Berlin, then to the Baltic. It is her wish fulfillment, not his. His diagnosis is her wish fulfillment, if you will, because it affords the opportunity to travel. The children, meanwhile, want to escape from the parents and only want them to leave. In short, they wish them dead. Even Trudy's death is her husband's unconscious wish fulfillment, if it means that he can finally experience the exotic. The start of the little ditty about the fly alludes to this homicidal wish fulfillment. Willst du sie morden? Do you want to kill it? Rudy is, not unsurprisingly, in the business of waste management. In the second half of Cherry Blossoms, Rudy travels to Tokyo to stay with his third, also unloving son, packing into his suitcase Trudy's clothes, which he often dons in order to live out the experiences she never had. The cross-dressing is also a means for him to recover not just a mental memory of his wife, it enables him to live out a physical closeness to her body, even identify with it. Even while roaming the streets of Tokyo, he wears her clothes underneath his. It's not incidental, therefore, and it's already been mentioned, that their names rhyme. Rudy also now starts to play the role of mother to their son Carly, making him sandwiches to bring to sandwiches to bring to lunch, while Carly repeats his father's life as a desk worker without recognizing that he does so. For Carly, whose apartment is tiny and soulless, Japan isn't a new and exciting place to live. Its only merit for him is that it is far away from his family he despised in Germany. Like the parents in Yasujiro Ozu's 1953 film Tokyo Story, to which Dörrie alludes, Rudy is disoriented by Tokyo, except now the experience of being lost in the translation of the new urban setting is combined with his bereavement. And of course, there is the Lost in Translation film of Sophie Coppola that also deals with Tokyo, an older man, and that. So, okay. So, but Cherry Blossoms does not simply create a simplistic opposition of East versus West, for urban life is just as cold and confusing to Rudy in Tokyo as it was to him in Berlin. Japan, therefore, at least initially, also serves as a spatial marker of emptiness rather than a plenitude of new experiences. The name doublings continue as Rudy meets under the spring bloom of cherry blossoms a young homeless waif who has lost her mother the previous year. She confuses Rudy by stating her name in her broken English, I am you. Later in the film, they also dress in identical kimonos at the hotel of the foot of Mount Fuji. And I think the basic problem I see with this film is that phrase, I am you. It's that identification which is going on here is a very problematic one. The orphan first catches Rudy's eye because she is performing Butoh, which she explains as a shadow dance that enables her to correspond with her dead mother. The purpose of its slow gestures is to catch, feel, and trace the shadow inside of oneself. This translation or explanation is the first verbalization of what Butoh accomplishes. Yu's conscious enactment of tracing her mother's shadow inside herself is an act of mourning that escapes the trap of melancholia's refusal of signification. And I'm too also thinking here of Abraham and Torok's Shell and the Kernel, where the unvoiced entombment of the beloved inside oneself without admittance or performance of loss only perpetuates melancholia. Carly then is a good example of someone whose life is hollow, despite the for him exotic setting, because he refuses to admit the loss of family. As the film progresses and the older German travels with his young guide to Mount Fuji, Rudy's adventure truly becomes his own, not merely the enactment of his wife's desire. Although the mountain remains shrouded in cloud for the first several days after their arrival at the hotel, one night it does appear as if painted white against the dark sky. The widower, too, paints his face white and darkens his eyes with kohl to descend to the lake where the mountain is exquisitely reflected. As he mimes the Butoh movements, Trudy's body appears next to his, and they both collapse together in a kind of Liebestod, evocative not just of Wagner, but of Aschenbach's death by the seaside, and of course Thomas Mann's novella. What is different is that the Asian custom now facilitates and authorizes communication with the lover, and thus signifies for the Westerner the completion of the mourning process and acceptance of death. To come back again to Freud's Das Unheimliche, but with a gentler assessment than which I opened, for Rudy, the intimately known, his wife, becomes the uncanny doubling to which he submits himself. His Butoh enactment at the close is not simply an ethnic drag performance, it's a performance of his wife and for his wife. It is neither flamboyant nor showy as one expects in drag performances. With his large, aged face, he appears like a melancholic clown, with the white chalk painting his sadness and abjection. However much the performance involves heavy makeup, it is thus not to mask loss, but to openly reveal loss. My problem with the film is that the waif-like, perpetually sweet Asian woman facilitates for the German the reconciliation with himself. And I want to also point out that striking scene in the film when Rudy visits a bathhouse in Tokyo, where he is washed by naked Asian girls who are portrayed as very ordinary looking young prostitutes and not the fantasy of Asian beauty. Dörrie has said about the girls, how they look and what they do with him contradict every cliche. I find that although it may be the case that the representation of these girls is unconventional, again, what we have in them is the image of the poor Asian girl. And that's what we have then with the character of Yu. As well, the interaction between Asian and Western culture, the interaction camouflages the shallowness with which Dörrie depicts the equally grieving Japanese woman, and hence disguises how mundane or conventional the focus on the Bildungsreise of the German is. The Western eye becomes one of them. Rudy enacts the Butoh dance. And so what I'm saying is that we're having here that narrative trajectory of a rather mundane Bildungsreise, which is also and certainly very much an act of mourning. But what then about the character of Yu? Julia Kristeva, whose work incidentally in Black Sun I find really fascinating for talking about the representational processes that are going on in melancholia and how she makes distinctions between well, I can't remember now, I'm sorry. But I find her work is very, very helpful for those of us who work in the field of discussing film and literature and painting. So Julia Kristeva pleads in Nations Without Nationalism that we recognize ourselves as strange in order to better appreciate the foreigners outside us, instead of striving to bend them to the norms of our own repression. End quote. To be sure, Rudy embodies a character who moves from being at home in his insular world of job, home, and wife in Bavaria, to being at loss with himself in the wake of his bereavement, which leaves him open to travel, unexpected kinship, and ultimately to the mystery of death. But to maintain, as Kristeva does, that, quote, only strangeness is universal, unquote, underplays the major cultural, class, and gender differences that allows a filmmaker like Dörrie to focus on the self-exploration of a German via a claim to universal uniqueness. It allows for Rudy to befriend the orphan without the tragedy of her story as homeless and destitute in a mega-rich environment to be explored apart from its poignancy and apparent oddity. Kristeva speaks of the duty and responsibility of being boundary subjects, but moral imperative to be a boundary subject are not the same for Rudy as they are for the prostitutes, or as to be a boundary subject, as in the case of the homeless youth, despite the fact that we learn that he has left his money, that Rudy has left his money to her. Their meeting on the common ground of the loss of a beloved family member allows Dörrie to play up the age, gender, and cultural differences between you and Rudy, indeed to overlap these three categories, all in the name, though, of erasing difference on the basis of friendship. What actually occurs, however, is the opposite. The plot that constructs their friendship allows for Yu's poignant story to be relegated to a backstory. She remains a static character while Rudy is allowed to change and adapt. In the final moments of Cherry Blossoms, Yu is back in the park performing Butoh, holding one end of the phone with the other dangling in the cherry tree, signifying an imagined conversation with Rudy. Like Rudy, the young girl offers an idiosyncratic embodiment of Butoh in order to stage loss. But in these closing, cloying moments, she functions as representative of an authentic Orient caught back in time, a colorful oddity relegated to performing a wordless ritual understandable only to herself. At the time of making the film, if I recall correctly, and I don't want to be quoted on this, Dörrie was mourning the death of her much older husband. Or perhaps it was also earlier when she had gone previously to Japan. I can't recall the exact details of her life story. In speaking about her film, Dörrie said, "In the best circumstance, this pain leads one to take up contact with others. One needs to be capable of seeing one's own pain in others, to rediscover oneself in others, not to just live egocentrically." The problem with Dörrie's phrasing is that she focuses on finding oneself in the other, not seeing one's own pain in the other, and not seeing, of course, the other herself. So I'm going to hold this my talk to be quite brief. And in sum, Dörrie appeals to a Western spectatorship that would fancy itself as alienated from its own hegemonic culture, and that feeds a cosmopolitan identity of travel to lands previously considered distant. The picture-perfect filmic location as endpoint functions as the ideal image for cultural consumption, even better for its affect-loaded meaning. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Alice Kuzniar. In my mind, it's a great idea to turn to conception of unheimlich of Freud and objection of Julia Kristeva in her book, if I don't mistaken, Le pouvoir de l'erreur. Oui. Which gives us an experience of alienation and objection of our imaginary, and through that we have to find new symbolical points to combine a new identity, a new personality. You know, she described how we, through the position, through alienation and the rejection of oral objects, that she calls objection. objection. I think that's a great idea. Thank you very much for highlight them in details. And I would like to pass the word speaker, a teacher of contemporary dance from Hamburg, Verena Lohner. Please tell us a couple of words about the film, about your practice, your ideas about our discussion. Please, you are very welcome.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for having me here. And I'm already very overwhelmed and deeply impressed of my four speakers' points and insights that I almost have changed my entire thing that I prepared. So I'm living in Hamburg, and having lived in Japan and studied there fine arts and contemporary arts like concept art, having studied fine arts and theater, and recently Canadian clown training, and coming so interdisciplinary from arts, fine arts, dance, and being a systemic facilitator, also working with lots of humans who are in loss and change and mourning. So what in Doris Dörrie's film Hanami Kirschblüten appears to me the most after seeing it recently was that it has partly aged. When I've seen it first, it was briefly before I lived in Japan, and it was, well, I recognized things. And meanwhile, I found, wow, that's different, looking at Japanese arts and culture and politics. To highlight it with one quote, when I studied in Japan, my work in Germany was mainly, I worked in historical context with artists that had been working during World War II or in the First World War, like Käthe Kollwitz or Kirchner or other people. And in Japan, the artists in fine arts, at least also in other performative environments, weren't dealing with these topics. In Germany, I grew up, I was used to historical events are visible in fine arts and in contemporary dancing and physical arts. In Japan, there was nothing like that. So I asked my professor, and what did the artists that were living in World War II or experienced the war? And he told me, well, if an artist did paint flowers before the war, he did paint flower during war, and he did paint flowers after the war. And that was pretty eye-opening for me to now coming to Butoh, as being Butoh a force of rebellion and resistance against the established arts and structure. And on the same side, rooting in all the precious and spiritual and the fantastically developed qualities of Japanese arts. So there is for me a contradiction in Hanami that's visible in what Alice also mentioned. For me, there are some things meanwhile, I'm like, what? That's strange. Still, I see Hanami as a very valuable piece of movie, of art, to inspire us. What I found is in there many, it's more like, for me, it's more like a collage of things I can see. That's, for example, the way Rudy gets lost in Tokyo reminds me very much of Walter Benjamin and his Tarif. Get yourself lost in a city like in a forest. And that for me was very, very powerfully drawn in that movie. So there are several things that sort of are strangely puzzling together. And on the other side, I can, from my momentary field of working in movement theater and dance, basically in Pochinko clown training, which is a Canadian clown training, I can now watch that movie with lots of peace and interest and take in, well, this is a very inspiring piece that can give us advice and examples for how we can artistically deal with loss and mourning, grief, based on losing identity, losing home, losing family, or whatever we can see in that movie. I have had prepared a little presentation, but it feels odd to show this now. From my field, I'm coming, as I mentioned, from theater and fine arts, and meanwhile, I'm still studying because, like Butoh, pachinko clown training, and I now put these aside, more like distant siblings, to put it in the end together, having a close look on Hanami, Kirschblüten. So pachinko clown training as Butoh has been established in the 1980s in Canada by a Polish artist that had been moving to Canada in the early 50s, and then established an art form. He put in the words, clown is the deconstruction and the destroying of the definition, and putting it together in the most humane and loving and peaceful way. So others than Butoh, that's also a sort of destructive and dark, the shadow, it's the dance of the darkness. Clown is the dance of everything and all the aspects of humanity. And so watching Hanami, often I was thinking, well, this is only focusing on that. Of course, the story of all the characters, even the side characters, they all are drawn like they have lost either identity or their way or whatever. Even the places they are going to are partly lost. Like if you ever had joined a Hanami session, it's super weird. It's pure beauty sitting underneath the cherry trees, but overall the objects are basically sort of not. They are the opposite of what cherry blossoms are. They are plastic that will last forever. They drink things that are not the best. So coming back to that, I often, watching Hanami, had things like, why don't they go on the light side? And that, again, brings me to the power that having the physicality of Butoh is, for me, the most interesting thing. It's not, and now I'm coming from the field of movement, very much in the moment, and having studied movement wherever I did go. And even if it was physics, it's always about movement. To me, it's a powerful statement, having movement as an access to deal with loss and grief and mourning. Not only talking about or being it a problem, but being it a part of humanity, and having movement and access to the hidden things as well as to the conscious things. And this brings me to pachinko clown training, which is a process where movement deals with the subconsciously hidden things the body stores over the time. If I'm growing up in a good environment, in an easy, having a happy childhood, my body is storing that. If I have to leave my home and wander, find places, if I'm a refugee or have to migrate, my body stores this. If I experience bad people around me, or grief or pain, this is all stored in our bodies. Of course, also in our conscious mind, but mainly in our bodies. Like if you have heard of Julie Henderson with her somatic work, she's dealing a lot with that, approaching it with yoga, with the ancient sort of yoga. And so Butoh, with being rooted in very ancient art form of dance, is also dealing with imagination and physicalization, also to create a belief. For example, if you can see in Hanami in the ending that Rudy is finding through the for finally being able to imagining what he has lost, to be able to go deeper into that. Again, it stays on the dark side, so I like going on the light side. Having an example of a person I had in a class teaching baby clown, which is the initial training of pachinko clown training, and it has a lot of similarities like Butoh, which we all have in the movie. We have, for example, the props. You in the movie is using props, which is another thing than having art or a costume. She has a beautiful or pretty costume, which is more uncommon for Butoh, but it's sort of special and not super nice. This is maybe a part I agree with Alice. There's a sort of like, why does that have to be so pretty? And there is always props. The cardigan Rudy's wearing is a prop like you'd have in clown, and that helps the physicalization to be more full. And in the baby clown process, which I'm referring to now as a parallel to Rudy's story, I once had a woman whose family was migrating from Persia, today Iran, and they are still talking about Persia. They never accepted Iran as the country. And she was sort of overcompensating. She is working in a bank, and even if the parents are, the mother instantly fell into depression when they came to Germany, refused to talk German ever, the father being in open depression and mourning the loss of culture, having left family and his cultural roots behind. The both parents were as in melancholy and in grief, stuck physically and mentally. So the children overcompensated, being active, being very good functioning and everything perfect. And so this woman came to me and taking pachinko baby clown training. And it's a process where you use your body, then release things. You stir up with subconsciously moving the body in a certain frame into the clay. There's a clay, then the clay is going to be paper mache. And then you subconsciously again deal the paper mache with colors, you paint it, and then you make it variable. And then through tactile movement, you put again another layer on it. You turn the mask into a character. And in the end, you put it all together. So similar than that what you have said before, or referring to Freud, the me, the person, the I is being put apart and then being put together newly. And this woman in the end found out, even if the movements weren't strong, but still she had the frame, there are restrictions like in Butoh that it has to be a certain way. In the end, she found something. She surprised herself by being able to dance a dance she had learned as a child back there in Persia. She had forgotten. And she stood there crying tears of being overwhelmed and being joyous. Well, I thought I had lost that dance, and there it is. She didn't even remember that the dance was in her. So that was, for me, the biggest example of how movement can not only being the expression, but also being revealing things and make them touchable. So others than therapy art forms, pachinko clown training is having therapeutic impact, but it's not meant as therapy. And there, back to coming to Hanami, is my thing I see in Hanami, that it has an therapeutic aspect, the Butoh, the dance form, with his being mysterious, being not understandable, and not being wanted to understand. So it's not meant that we understand it. It's meant that we feel it. That it's meant that we get out of the process with an raised awareness, whether it's for myself or if I may watch it, being elevated to a new awareness, which happened to Rudy watching you. or which had happened before, to Trudy having experienced Butoh and instantly being awakened as a person who wanted to dance in Butoh. So this was more sort of also a little puzzle, and hoping not to being too confusing for you. Thank you very much for listening, and thanks for giving me your inspirations. You already gave me a lot.
Thank you very much, Verena. Thank you for your report, and to emphasize both dark part and light part of dancing, and you attract our attention to the most complicated thing in our practice in clinic, a relation between depression and psychosomatics. And we are each day tracing and working with how depression turns into psychosomatic, and this is one of the most difficult question in psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. I think that we shall return to that question again, and I thank you very much for your report. I would like to invite my colleague from Buenos Aires, Natalia Glebova. You are very welcome.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm glad to be here. And Cherry Blossom is a very beautiful film meditation. Tells us about Rudy, a man who goes to Japan after the sudden death of his wife, Trudy. And the start of the film, Trudy finds out that Rudy is terminally ill, and she struggles with her thoughts of losing him. Her grief overwhelms her. As a viewer, I expected that this film will be about her grief, but everything changed in one moment. She doesn't know how to live without her husband. She doesn't know how to tell him that he is dying. And suddenly she dies. The story is changing, and Rudy doesn't know about his illness. He doesn't know last Trudy's secret and remains unaware until he dies. The theme of ignorance is very important in the film. No one knows anything. Rudy doesn't know what that he's dying. He doesn't truly know his wife. He doesn't know his children, and he doesn't know even himself. And he doesn't know what he wants, what he needs. He lives a routine life and wants nothing to be changed. His life feels stuck, and Trudy was also stuck. She gave up her own life for her family, children, for her husband, and she became a shadow of her husband. Reflecting on the film, the sacrifice by Tarkovsky, we discussed this film last time. I could say that Trudy sacrificed herself. Even by dying, she somehow saved her husband from pain of his illness. And Rudy's journey to Japan is his way to trying to understand his wife and connect with her. It reminds me another film, The Fontaine, which also tells us about the grief. In Fontaine, a man deals with the loss of his wife, and Darren Aronofsky uses powerful images to show us the impact of mourning. Doris Dörrie, who lost her husband, he was dead from cancer, and she does it in her beautiful poetry way, uses the Japanese idea of mono no aware, which means recognizing the beauty of the shortness of life. This idea is a cherry blossoms which bloom for a short time and then fall. Through the sudden death highlights how quickly life can change and starts Rudy on a way of understanding and dealing with his grief. This is very beautiful and very sad story. And we can see beauty of grief in this story. I also remember essay, Freud's essay, Mourning and Melancholia, and Vamic Volcan, Life After Loss. Freud describes mourning as when the shadow of the lost object affects the self. And in the film, Rudy dances Butoh dance with shadow, like a shadow. He wears Trudy's clothes to feel connection with her. This way of connection will be lost in part of his grief. In the end, there is a total introjection of the lost object, and Trudy initially becomes a reflection of Trudy. He becomes her shadow. Do you remember Mount Fuji? This is its reflection in the lake. So this forms one single page, mountain and its reflection. And also Rudy becomes this mountain and also reflection. He becomes a shadow and he dies. Vamic Volcan talks about using linking objects to stay connected with those who have died, like personal items or special places. He also says that loss not only causes emotional pain, but also requires us to change in how we see ourselves. After losing a loved one, our identity changes. In Cherry Blossom, Rudy's trip in Japan and his effort to understand Rudy's world help him preserve her memory and reflect on his own transformation. In Japan, Rudy becomes more alive and finds new purpose of life. The recurring image of this is image of fly. I have a question, like what is this image for you? How do you give, which interpretation do you give for this image? Because for me it symbolizes a reminder of death, of missing life and missed opportunities in life. And when Rudy came to Japan, he said that here's no flights, so no reminder anymore, because he is alive and he his new purpose of life. And important image, as I said, in film is Mount Fuji and its reflection, symbolizing life and death, masculine and feminine, Rudi and Trudy, love and grief. And I think love and grief are connected from the earliest months of our lives. Because for infant, the mother is a primary attachment object, and even a brief separation can feel like a big pain for a baby. So grief is a natural part of the human experience of love, starting from the earliest relationship. Love and loss are closely connected, and the process of attachment involves both the joy of closeness and the pain of possible loss. Cherry Blossom helps us understand the pain of losing someone and the beauty of life's brief moments. It shows us how grief can lead to deeper self-understanding and new meaning in our life. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Natalia, for your report. Thank you very much, and for your ideas. In my mind, the lake is a symbol of mirror stage. And to elaborate our grief circumstantially, usually we need another culture to reflect ourselves. And you understand me very well. We reflect in another Argentinian to recombine our own identity. Thank you very much. And I would like to pass the word to last but not the least speaker in Paris, Dr. Maria Bezliudnaia. S'il vous plaît, dis-nous votre interprétation.
Hey, bonjour. Thank you for inviting me to this discussion. And Dmitry, I would like to choose the film. I've seen many different lines for interpretation within it. However, today I want to focus on this that struck me the most. To start my speech, I would like to traditionally quote, woman is a symptom for man, while man is the ravage for woman. I think that I will present the other aspect of the film, and especially the relationship with the woman and the man, because I quote this phrase to Lacan. I can repeat it: the woman is a symptom for man, while man is the ravage for woman. Lacan's statement, woman is a symptom for man, is based on the concept that a symptom represents the expression of unconsciousness, desire, and conflict. In this context, the woman becomes some symbol of his own unconsciousness, desire, and identity rupture for the man. This is because the man searching for a woman finds her a reflection of his unrecognized desire and feeling, which he seeks to understand and integrate into his personality. The phrase man is the ravage for woman, which can be translated as destruction or devastation, point to the intense emotional and physical effect that the man can cause in a woman. On the one hand, the ravage can refer to the passion and deep emotional turmoil that a man evokes in a woman. On the other hand, it can signify the destructive effect that may arise in a relationship when partners fail to resolve their internal conflict and projection. This concept underscores the complexity and ambivalence of human sexuality and relationship, which is central to Lacan's theory. I would like to apply this theory to this film to examine this escape from the symptom, characterized by the imaginary expressed in the symbolic, the loss of the object, and consequently to the real. Let me explain what I mean. The film Cherry Blossom tells the story of an older man named Trudy who have lost his wife Trudy, travels to Japan to understand her life and dreams. This film can be analyzed by paying attention to several key points. Desire and loss. The central theme of the film is desire and loss. Trudy's death forced Rudy to risk his life and understand the desires she cherished. Lacan asserted that desire is closely linked to absence and loss. And in Rudy's case, the loss of his wife became a catalyst for the discovery of his own unspoken desire. Symbolic and real. This film also observed a transition from the symbolic order, Rudy's life in Germany with its structured family and work, to the real, his journey to Japan and encounter with the traditional he doesn't know fully understand. Japan and the cherry blossom become symbols of something other and unknown, related to the deep structure of the unconscious. Image and fantasy. The film constantly plays images and symbols, which are the cherry blossom, which symbolize the ephemerality and brevity of life. Rudy's encounter with the Butoh troupe and his desire to understand and experience the life portrait of stage by Trudy's highlight the importance of fantasy and images in construction our reality. The other. In Lacanian theory, the other occupies a special place in the formation of identity. In the film, Rudy is striving to understand his wife through her dreams, encounters a culture that is an other for him, thus creating a new perspective on his identity and existence. The instrument that helps to process the loss, to let go of his symptom and transition out of the imaginary order of life in the dance of Butoh. This is a very interesting moment. Total allow us to trace and understand the protagonist's exit from the symptom of repetition, leaving his symptom behind for the real, the other, and a turn to understand his wife not just as a part of his symptom, filed reality, but to recognize her desire and finally meet her as the other. Butoh is a Japanese form of modern dance that emerged in the late 1915, known for its expressive physically and abstract movement. To interpret Butoh dance from the perspective of Lacanian psychoanalysis, it is important to focus on several key aspects. Body and the symbolic. In Lacanian psychoanalysis, the body is considered a part of the symbolic order, where cultural and social meaning are inscribed. Butoh dance art often explores the extreme boundaries of corporeality, transcending conventional limits, which can be seen as an exploration of rupture and continuity between the body and the symbolic order. The inconscient, and the real. Butoh can be interpreted as a means of penetrating the real, the aspect that cannot be fully symbolized or understood. Lacan asserted that the real is inexpressible and incomprehensible. Butoh, with its abstract and often shocking movement, can be a form of expressive those aspects of human experience that lie beyond language and rationality. Fantasy and desire. Butoh dance can also be perceived as an experience of unconsciousness, fantasy, and desire. Through unique and spontaneous movement, dancer can manifest unrecognized desire and conflict, creating an opportunity for the expression and interpretation. Destruction and creation of identity. Lacan emphasized how identity is formed in the mirror state, whereas the child first perceives their body as whole. It's Butoh, the body is often portrayed in fragmented or altered forms, which can symbolize the process of destroying and reevaluating identity. This can be a way to explore and reconceptualize one's personality by transcending habitual physical and symbolic forms. Et à la fin, c'est the other. The other, Butoh often explore themes of mimesis and transformation, which can be linked to the concept of the other. In Lacanian theory, through bodily expression, dancer can challenge and rethink the identity, both individuality and collectivity. This element helps understand how Butoh can be a means of exploring the unconsciousness and seeking new horizons of self-expression. In this film, it's Intet and Butoh dance intertwined, allowing an alternative perspective, I'm sorry, of the human life experience, offering a view of the real, the body, the symbolic desire, as well as loss and the other as necessary stages to leave behind one's symptom and realize one's desire. And thank you for your attention.
Je vous remercie, madame, par votre rapport. Très intéressant. Does anybody have any questions, additions, contradictions, something to add and to comment? If no, we are working almost 2 hours, and it was very interesting, complicated, and great work. Thank you very much for all of us, for all speakers, for all listeners. I am full of new ideas, which I shall maintain and elaborate for several days. That was a really new experience and very, very interesting meeting and discussion for me. I would like to thank you and wish you a good weekend.
Thank you, everybody, as well.
See you next